the energy has already transferred up the chain. The energy is transferred up the chain. You can think about like kind of a tornado effect where that energy just spirals its way up the chain, and the last thing to go is the arm. Hey, what's going, guys? Ben Brewster with Triathletics. I wanted to break down Daniel Espino. Just went in the first round, obviously a highly touted pitcher out of high school, but he's a guy in particular who isn't necessarily the most physically imposing guy. I believe he's listed at 6'3", 200, but not a kid who's had a huge history of weight training, carries a ton of muscle mass on him, still has a ton of room to improve, and yet he's throwing into the upper 90s. He's very, very efficient from a mechanical standpoint. So what I want to do is kind of break down what I see, what he does so well from a mechanical standpoint, and why I believe he could throw 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 miles an hour harder than he is right now in the future as he continues to develop physically. But let's just break down a little bit what he does so well mechanically. So this is a side view from Perfect Game of his delivery, just to give you an idea. So from the start, what he does so well. Now, the point of the leg lift, he still throws hard from a slide step. So this is more of a rhythm-based thing. I would be a little bit more concerned if his very first move he started reaching forward with the hip. He does a pretty good job of staying stacked and not getting stuck back over the rubber. So he's not getting stuck with his head all the way back here. He stays relatively upright. He gets a little bit of a forward move, but I think what he's doing in particular with this leg lift and how he's utilizing the leg lift to increase his velocity is he's using it to gain a little bit of this posterior tilt action of his pelvis. So as he lifts his leg, he's tilting his pelvis back. You can see that pelvic angle right there. I think what he's doing here is he's using that to basically load into the next step of his delivery. So from that posterior tilt position, he's then riding that angle and unloading it into more of an anterior tilted position. So he's loading into this posterior tilt. He's using the height of the leg lift to drive that pelvis back into posterior tilt. So that's how I think he's utilizing the leg lift. Some pitchers have said that, like Nolan Ryan, for example, he always felt like the higher he lifted his leg, the harder he threw. But the way that Nolan Ryan utilized the leg lift was he would use it to actually gain more forward momentum. The higher he lifted his leg, the further he actually shifted his weight. Daniel is not really doing that. He's not getting his weight all the way out here during his leg lift like somebody like Nolan Ryan. Instead, he's using it to kind of preload the pelvis and preload the ensuing sit into his back leg. So I think that's what he's getting. That's what he's getting out of the initial move. But this is what he does. This is what's very special about him, is he's able to really drop and load into that back leg, and he's able to keep a very vertical shin angle at this point and really load up that rear glute. So he's maintaining contact through the heel over the rubber. He's maintaining this vertical shin angle, and then he's really able to load up and get his weight into that, for him, his right glute. Okay, he's leading with the hips at this point, but he's able to keep his upper half back. He's able to keep his head well back over the back hip. So he's creating some pretty strong angles to drive from. Notice that he's still very loose through his arm. The arm at this point, there's no active engagement of the arm, of the scap. He's letting it go through its natural pendulum action. And then as he actually begins to lift it up, there's a little bit of involvement from the scap, but he's letting that arm swing take it through its natural pendulum action. The arm is floating down through this arc, floating down and around and up. It's going through that natural, loose, floating pendulum action right here. Now, as he is moving forward, he's holding this knee back over the rubber. He's holding that vertical shin angle. What a lot of guys do is they start to leak this knee forward as they move forward. Now, what he's doing, and what a lot of hard throwers do very well, is he's holding that knee back as he moves forward. And what that's doing is creating a stretch through the adductor, through the groin. It's pre-stretching all of these, it's eccentrically stretching these internal rotators of this rear hip. And what that does is that allows you to basically hold this knee back as long as you can, and it allows you to power this knee down to the ground and then power into internal rotation a little bit more forcefully. Let's look at Jordan Hicks real quick, just as a good way to see what I'm talking about here. So Jordan Hicks has a very similar leg lift. He utilizes it in much the same way, where he's kind of tilting that pelvis back towards first base during the leg lift and using the height of the leg lift to drive that pelvis back. And then as he's unloading, he really drops into that back leg and he's able to hold that knee back for a very long time. So as he rides forward, he's maintaining that vertical shin. He's creating a big stretch through this rear leg. And watch how quickly he's able to go from that position and drive that knee down to the ground. Notice he's not pushing through the quad. He's not extending the leg. He's not jumping off the back leg. He's holding it back, stretching, pre-stretching, and eccentrically loading the adductor, the groin area, and the internal rotators. And then he's just unloading that tension. And so it's a very quick snapping action of that knee down to the ground. This knee's driving down to the ground, not forcefully extending through the quads. So that's one thing that Daniel does very well. So he's able to get from this position. A lot of guys can get into this position, but they aren't able to get out of this position into landing. He's getting into this very hunched over position over the back leg, but then he's able to get out of it. He's able to let that lower half rotate underneath his upper half, and he's able to rotate that knee down to the ground. Most guys push with the quad from that position. A lot of lower velocity throwers, they push from the quad, and they end up, because as you push with the quad, it ends up creating this counter action with the upper half, and those guys end up having a very, very tilted shoulder angle at landing, and they end up throwing uphill and not able to get back down over their front side. So he's able to get out of that position, rotate that knee down to the ground. That's only possible because he has A, good sequencing, but B, he has very good mobility through hip internal and external rotation. So being able to do that, that is hip internal rotation, to be able to get that knee down to the ground, and being able to hold that position right here, that is relative hip external rotation. So mobility is very important from that position, but we're just getting started as far as what's really impressive mobility-wise about him. So from here, let's actually go to the front view to see this, because it's a little bit more impressive from here. So again, he corkscrews into landing. He's driving that knee down to the ground. Hips are open at landing, almost entirely open. Look where his arm is. Look how close his shoulder angle is relative to the pelvis. So he's creating a ton of hip-shoulder separation here. He's creating an incredible amount of scapular retraction and horizontal abduction. I mean, we have a crazy amount of daylight between his head and between his arm. So he's really getting into this scap-loaded position here. And that's creating this huge preloading, this huge stretch through his pectorals. Not only that, not only are we getting a stretch, activating the stretch shortening cycle for the pecs, and really being able to kind of get that elastic effect, but we're also able to apply force over an extremely large range of motion when you're able to get the arm back that far once the hips have fully opened. So he's able to apply force to the ball from here all the way to about here. So he has this incredibly long arc of force application into the ball. If at landing his arm was, let's say, just behind his head, if this is where his arm was in the ball, he would only be applying force to the ball over a much smaller range of motion. So he'd have to apply significantly more force to be able to throw as hard, all else equal. So he's getting into crazy deep positions, and he's able to very efficiently sustain his velocity. He's not just touching these numbers randomly. He's able to really sustain that velocity consistently, because he's getting that velocity from mechanical efficiency, not just from drinking a bunch of caffeine, getting hyped up, and active muscular effort, having to supply that velocity. So when athletes are able to sustain velocity outing to outing and deep into games, it tends to imply they're getting that velocity from mechanical efficiency, from properly utilizing the stretch shortening cycle, and from properly sequencing their body and throughout the kinetic chain. So really utilizing those positions to stretch the pectorals, again, one of the main accelerators of the arm. And then you'll see here, he starts to get this very arched, extended position, good hip extension, but specifically good thoracic spine extension and rotation. So he's really able to hold the shoulders back and get this whip effect through his upper back. He's not getting a ton of extension through his low back. Again, you can't entirely see that with his jersey on, but you shouldn't be getting a ton of that motion from your low back. The low back at this point, the lumbar spine is staying neutral, it's stiffening, and you're getting a lot of this motion. You should be getting a lot of that motion from the T-spine and motion from the hips. A lot of athletes will end up with low back issues when they try to generate a lot of this rotation and extension from the lumbar spine because they don't have that range in the T-spine, or they don't have that range down the chain, either in the foot or pelvic area. So really, really efficient position here. And you'll notice he's still letting the arm lay back. The arm is lagging behind the plane of the shoulders. This is his shoulder plane. As he begins rotating, the arm is lagging back. So he's still in this relaxed position where the torso is leading the rotation. The arm is lagging back. And he's allowing that rotation to stretch the pec and lay the ball back. Let's go back to the side view. So let's look at the angle of his elbow at landing. An ideal angle at this position is somewhere around 90 degrees. Somewhere around 90. Now that does vary. He's a little bit outside 90. That does vary based on the guy. Typically we'll see guys that have a little bit of a wider, bigger valgus carrying angle. Oftentimes they're a little bit outside 90. Tends to be where they fall. And then some guys are a little bit closer inside 90. But somewhere in the 90 or 85 to 100 degree range, 75 to 100 degree range, somewhere in that 90 degree. If this is 90, he's a little bit outside that. Some guys are a little bit inside that. But you typically don't want to see an arm lagging out here, and you don't want to see an arm way in there. There are exceptions. Bartolo Colonna is one exception, but typically this is the most efficient position that you'll see in the majority of upper 90s 100-mile-an-hour throwers. And I would definitely put him in that category of 100-mile-an-hour throwers, even if he hasn't quite hit 100, because he is so underdeveloped physically, but just has such efficient movement patterns at this point. So an efficient position to sink the ball into the plane of rotation at 90 degrees, elbow in line with the shoulders. He's rotating the torso around that axis. So he's creating a good axis of rotation. He's not just pushing the ball towards the target and forward crunching into release. He's rotating about the axis of his spine. And again, he has very good mobility just about everywhere in his body, but he's creating an incredible amount of layback. So this is the angle of his torso. He's getting more than 180 degrees of layback, I would say, from this position. So he's incredibly mobile through his shoulder as well, which just lends itself to being able to create elite velocities. And then as he finishes, that energy is directed through the tip of the whip. You'll notice he's not massively pulling off his head towards first base. He's not massively pulling off his thoracic spine. He's not bowing way out with the knee. The energy has already transferred up the chain. The energy is transferred up the chain. You can think about like kind of a tornado effect, where that energy just spirals its way up the chain, and the last thing to go is the arm. And so there shouldn't be a ton of excess motion from the rest of the body at ball release and a couple frames going into ball release, because that energy should have already spiraled up the chain and finished transferring, and ultimately the arm is the last thing that goes. So it's usually a major inefficiency when guys try to tie their shoulder internal rotation, that final bit of internal rotation, into ball release. They'll tie it into the neck snapping off to the side, or the torso snapping off to the side, and that just represents an energy leak. But he does not have that. He does a very good job of directing all that energy into the ball and directing it through the tip of the whip into ball release. So what goes into actually creating that layback and some of these positions, you really do need good tissue quality through the entire upper extremity, through the pecs, pec major, pec minor, subclavius. Also looking at how the arm moves overhead. You need good mobility through the lats, teres major, long head of the tricep. These are all areas that get really gritty, really nasty, depending on your history of training, depending on genetic factors. Some of these areas can be a little bit harder to target. But some guys really do need to focus on tissue quality and improve some of these positions. I'm not saying everybody's going to have the ability to get their arm this far back. This is Sir Anthony Dominguez. Just look at him really briefly. But you can improve that drastically by working on the soft tissue quality and the motion that you have, the mobility with certain different corrective drills through your upper extremity. And then not just making sure you have that mobility statically, but making sure that you can control that end range and you have strength through length. You have strength in some of these deeper positions. That's one of the reasons that we train through such a full range of motion in just about everything that we do. But real quick, just comparing Daniel Espino to one more big leaguer whose mechanics I love. This is Sir Anthony Dominguez. I would say he's got almost perfect mechanics as far as lower half and getting into some really deep stretch positions. But he does very similar job. Doesn't have the same leg lift, but very similar job of loading into that deep sit position. Not quite as crazy as Daniel's. And he had a really good job of, from there, driving the knee down to the ground, not going into triple extension, not jumping towards the plate, but corkscrewing that knee down to the ground, just like Daniel does, and letting that arm lag behind with this incredible stretch through the pecs. Again, you see the arm way back behind the line of the body, this great scapulated position. And then he's a guy, just like we talked about, he's a guy who maintains his velo incredibly well. He sits 97 to 99 consistently just about every time because he's creating that velocity from mechanical efficiency and from proper sequencing through the kinetic chain. So just another example of what upper 90s mechanics look like. Again, not everybody throws exactly the same and is going to throw this way, but for guys that have great mobility and can get in and out of some of these positions, Daniel is just a very good example of that. And as he does continue physically maturing, I think he for sure has more velocity left in the tank if his body can sustain it and if he can, continue doing the things he needs to do to stay healthy. So hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Just a couple of my thoughts on Espino, and I do think he's going to be a special pitcher. He certainly moves in a very special way, but we can learn a lot from watching some of these very efficient guys throw. And it's not just about the number on the gun; it's about how efficiently they move and taking into account all the different variables. Him just not being very physically mature, but throwing as hard as he does. We can learn a lot from him. We can learn a lot, especially from smaller, undersized pitchers who throw very hard. So he's just a good example, and hopefully you guys got something out of this. Again, my name is Ben Brewster. This is Tread Athletics. If you guys have any questions for us, definitely leave a comment below. Definitely share this video if you found this helpful. And as always, if you have any questions for us, reach out to us. Contact at treadathletics.com, Twitter at Tread Athletics, Instagram, Tread_athletics. Thanks for watching, guys.